The first thing Thren felt was the deck plating trying to buck her off her feet, and the second thing she felt was her own voice, flat and steady, saying, "Send it," before her mind had finished deciding to say it. "Ma'am." Commander Yssa had one hand braced against the tactical console and the other still hovering over the transmission controls like it might bite him. "That's the Deathworld frequency. Nobody outside the Council archive is even supposed to know that world exists. Nobody outside this bridge is supposed to know we've lost the aft shields either, and yet here we are." Another impact rolled through the hull, and somewhere below decks, a bulkhead screamed metal on metal in a way that meant it wasn't going to hold much longer. "Send it, Commander. That's an order, and it's the last one I'm going to repeat." He sent it. The lights dimmed to half power as the transmission array drew everything it had left. On the main display, the beacon's signal path stretched out across the black in a thin gold line, arcing away from the burning wreck of the Fourth Fleet, and out toward a quadrant of space the Concord had spent 70 years pretending was empty. Thren watched the line travel. She had read the Earth file more times than any officer alive who wasn't dead or retired, and she had never once expected to be the one who broke the seal on it. Behind her, the tactical officer called out closing contacts, voice climbing half an octave. Thren didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on that gold line until it blinked out at the edge of sensor range, gone, sent, unrecoverable, and for one strange second the bridge was almost quiet, just the hum of dying systems and the distant metal scream, and she thought, "There. Now it's not just my problem anymore." Then the next volley hit, and it was very much still her problem. Mike Delgado was elbow-deep in a lawnmower engine that had no business being that stubborn when the government car pulled into his driveway. He didn't stop what he was doing. Government cars showed up at his place with some regularity, grant paperwork. A reservist he used to run with wanting a favor, once a congressional aide who'd gotten lost looking for a lake house 3 exits over. He got the carburetor bolt free, set it on the workbench in the exact spot he always set bolts so he wouldn't lose them, and only then looked up. The man getting out of the car was maybe 28, wearing a suit that had clearly never been to a briefing more serious than a budget review, and carrying a case that he held against his chest like it might run off if he loosened his grip. "Colonel Delgado." "Depends who's asking and whether they brought coffee." I don't have coffee. I'm with an office that doesn't have a public name. I need you to sign this before I can say anything else." He held out a clipboard. Delgado wiped his hands on a rag that made things dirtier rather than cleaner, took the clipboard and read it. Then he read it again because the words hadn't changed the first time and he wanted to be sure. "This a joke somebody put you up to?" "No, sir. Somebody from my old unit trying to get one over on me before deer season." "No, sir." Delgado signed it. He signed a lot of things in his life that started with the phrase asterisk the undersigned acknowledges and stopped reading past that phrase a long time ago, on the theory that if the government wanted to shoot him, they didn't need his signature first. The liaison, his name was Priest, which Delgado decided not to make a joke about, at least not yet, opened the case, and set a tablet on the workbench between the lawnmower parts. The video that played was shaky, half-static, clearly recovered off some kind of degraded signal. It showed the inside of what might have been a spacecraft bridge, alarm strobing red, and a voice speaking words that weren't in any language Delgado recognized, laid under a scrolling translation that the analysts had apparently thrown together with more urgency than confidence. "We require assistance. Our defenses have failed. We do not know if this signal will reach anyone. We do not know if anyone will answer. Please, anyone." Delgado watched it twice. Then he picked his rag back up and went back to the carburetor bolt, because his hands needed something to do while his head did its own work. "Is this real?" "As far as we can verify, yes." "And somebody in Washington's been sitting on it for how long?" 6 days, sir." 6 days. Delgado set the bolt down again. Aliens beg the human race for help and the response time is 6 days. There a form I need to fill out for that too, or does bureaucratic malpractice come with a form of its own? Priest didn't have an answer for that, which told Delgado everything he needed to know about how this was going to go if he waited for it to go through proper channels. He picked up his phone instead, and by the time Priest had finished stammering through an explanation of classification protocols, Delgado was already 3 calls into a list that had been sitting dormant in his contacts for the better part of a decade, waiting, it turned out, for exactly this kind of Tuesday. Dr. Renata Alvarez was closing up a gunshot wound in Trauma Bay 2 when her phone buzzed against her hip for the 4th time in an hour, and she ignored it for the 4th time, because the patient on her table didn't care who was calling. She finished the last suture, called the time and the vitals to the resident taking notes, and only then peeled off her gloves and checked the phone. 6 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, 1 voicemail and a text that just said, "Doc, it's Delgado. Call me when you can breathe. Bring your go bag." She hadn't touched that go bag in 4 years. She still knew exactly which closet shelf it was on. Ruth Reyes was under a stalled Bradley on a National Guard lot 2 states over, cursing a seized bolt in 3 languages, when her old team chat lit up for the first time since it had gone quiet after the last deployment. She read Delgado's message once, wiped her hands, and was in her truck before she'd finished deciding whether she believed it. Priya Nathan hadn't slept in 31 hours, and it showed in the fact that she'd triple-checked the same waveform 4 times and gotten a different answer each time, which was not how waveforms were supposed to work. She was the one who'd cracked the translation, junior analyst, plucked out of a graduate program because she'd published a paper 18 months earlier on signal patterning that exactly 1 government office in the country had bothered to read. She'd been proud of that for about 6 hours, before the weight of what she'd actually translated settled in. Now she sat in the back of a transport with people twice her age who all seemed to know each other from some previous life she hadn't been part of, running the original signal through analysis one more time because something in the beacon's underlying structure kept nagging at her. The distress call was real. The plea for help was real. But buried under the surface message, in a data layer that shouldn't have needed to be there at all for a simple distress beacon, was a second pattern, repeating, deliberate, encoded in a way that felt less like an accident of transmission and more like someone had hidden it there on purpose. She almost said something. Delgado was 3 seats up, going over manifest lists with Reyes like they were planning a hunting trip instead of first contact, and Alvarez was asleep sitting upright with the particular stillness of someone who'd trained her body to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself, because the opportunity might not come again for a while. Priya looked at the second pattern one more time, decided she didn't have enough to say anything useful yet, and closed the laptop. The transport's engines changed pitch beneath her, that low shift that meant they'd cleared the atmosphere, and there was nothing under them now but the dark. And somewhere out past that dark was a fleet marshal who'd broken 70 years of silence to ask 5 strangers for help she didn't know they were capable of giving. If you've ever had a feeling that the easy explanation wasn't the whole story, drop it in the comments, because Priya's about to find out just how right that instinct was. The relay station's arrival bay smelled like ozone and something floral that Delgado couldn't place, and the first Concord official to greet them was wearing a full hazard suit like he expected the humans to detonate on contact. Please remain behind the yellow line. Please do not touch any surfaces. Please. The official's translator device lagged half a second behind his mouth, which made everything he said sound like it was being subtitled by someone who didn't like him much. Please understand that your weapons violate no fewer than 17 station safety statutes, and until a formal exemption is. Son, you've got a swarm eating your station from the inside out in about 6 hours if the timeline in that briefing packet's accurate, Delgado said, not unkindly, already walking past the yellow line. You want to write me up for the sidearm, or you want to show me where your reactor conduits run so my machinist doesn't have to guess. Reyes was already crouched at an access panel, popping it with a multi-tool that had clearly opened more panels than the Concord engineer standing over her had opened in his entire career. This your primary coolant line. That is a restricted system. You cannot simply. I can and I'm gonna, unless you want to explain to your council why the station lost pressure because nobody wanted to break protocol. She had the panel off before he finished his sentence. Alvarez was already 3 steps down the corridor, medical kit slung over one shoulder, asking a passing Concord medic in halting phrasebook words where the wounded were being staged, and getting waved off and going anyway. The official's suit visor fogged slightly. Delgado recognized the look. It was the same look every green lieutenant got the first time they realized the manual didn't cover the situation in front of them. Fleet Marshal Thren is expecting you, the official finally said, deflating. This way, please don't touch anything. Nobody promised him anything. The evacuation alarm hit 40 minutes later, and it hit wrong. Delgado had heard 1,000 alarms in his life, and every one of them told him something about the mind that designed it, how urgent, how organized, how much the people running the drill actually believed something bad could happen to them. This one was elegant. Clean tones, rising in careful thirds, the kind of alarm designed by someone who had built it to be heard, not to be obeyed instantly. Around him, Concord personnel moved toward the evacuation corridors in orderly lines, glancing at status boards, waiting for confirmation before they hurried. Bloom's inside the outer ring, Priya said, reading a display over a technician's shoulder in a language she'd only had 6 days to learn secondhand from the recovered transmission data, piecing meaning together from cognates and desperation. I think they're saying it came in through a cargo lock that wasn't supposed to still be active. Which lock? Delgado was already moving. See something, C40, the signage isn't. Raise Alvarez on me. They found it before the Concord response team did, because the Concord response team was still filing through a decision tree that required sign-off from 2 separate department heads before deploying. And by the time that sign-off came through, Delgado's people were already in the breach corridor, watching something come apart the reactor housing like it was made of wet cardboard. It didn't look like an animal, and it didn't look like a machine. It moved like both and neither. A wet dark mass unfolding limbs that weren't limbs so much as extensions of intent, and it was fast in a way that made the Concord Marines behind Delgado freeze mid-stride, weapons half-raised, because everything in their training told them a threat this size should hesitate before committing to a breach this narrow, and it wasn't hesitating at all. Raise seal points. Delgado's voice didn't change register. Doc, we've got wounded past it, I can hear them. Go around through the maintenance crawl, get to them, don't engage. Copy. Alvarez was gone before he finished the sentence, folding herself into a service hatch half her height, with the kind of economy of motion that came from 30 years of trauma bays, where hesitation cost lives measured in seconds. Reyes was already welding a temporary bulkhead brace out of scavenged station framing, sparks scattering across the deck, working with her back half-turned to the thing tearing through the reactor housing 20 feet away because she'd triaged the threat correctly. The breach itself would kill more people than the creature would if nobody stopped the hull integrity failure first. The Concord Marines finally moved, and moved well. Delgado gave them that. Their formation discipline was clean, textbook, exactly what 4,000 years of doctrine should produce. It just wasn't built for an enemy that didn't retreat when it took fire and didn't slow when 2 of its limbs were severed and kept coming anyway, adapting its angle of attack between one heartbeat and the next like it was learning the room in real time. Delgado put 3 rounds into the mass center and watched it barely register, and understood in that instant, the way he'd understood a handful of times before in his life, that they were fighting the wrong fight if they were fighting to kill it here. Fall back to the brace line. Let Rays close it, don't try to win this room. One of the Marines didn't hear him, or didn't trust him, and went down hard when the thing changed direction faster than anyone standing there believed something that size should be able to. Alvarez found him on her way back with the first of the wounded already draped over her shoulder, another dragged along by his own working arm looped over her neck. She didn't stop moving. She got both of them past the brace line, set the first one down with the practiced roughness of triage, and then, without a word to anyone, turned around and went back through the gap Rays hadn't sealed yet. "Doc," Delgado's voice cracked for the first time that day. She came back 40 seconds later dragging the Marine who'd gone down, his armor scorched black down one side, blood pooling from somewhere Delgado couldn't immediately see, and Rays closed the brace behind them so hard the whole frame rang like a bell. The creature hit the new seal twice, testing it, and then, for reasons none of them understood yet, stopped, and receded back into the wreckage of the reactor housing like something that had simply lost interest, or run some private calculation, and decided the math no longer favored it. The wounded Marine lived because Alvarez didn't stop to ask permission from anyone, before opening his chest cavity right there on the deck plating, station medics, hovering uselessly with instruments that weren't built for wounds this specific. Watching a 61-year-old trauma surgeon with blood to her elbows work like she'd done this exact procedure 100 times, because she had, just never on this particular species. He was conscious again 20 minutes later, staring up at her with an expression that had nothing to do with the pain medication. "Why did you go back for me?" he said, through his own translator device, voice raw. "The tactical assessment would have written me off. I would have written myself off." Alvarez didn't look up from packing her kit. "You were on the ground and it wasn't done with you yet. That's not tactics, that's just Tuesday." Later, in the cramped berth the station had grudgingly assigned them, Rays was laughing so hard she had to put her welding torch down, and Delgado was grinning despite the fact that his hands hadn't fully stopped shaking, and a Concord liaison standing in the doorway looked genuinely disturbed by the sound of it. "You're laughing," she said. "No, ma'am." Rays wiped her eyes. "That's just what it sounds like when a man finds out he's still got all his fingers." The liaison didn't have a follow-up for that. She left looking like she needed to sit down somewhere quiet, which, Delgado thought, was probably the most honest reaction anyone on this station had had all day. Priya found him alone 20 minutes later, tablet clutched against her chest the way Priest had held his case back on Earth a lifetime ago, and she didn't sit down before she started talking, like she needed to get the words out before her nerve ran out with them. "That thing back there, it didn't fight like the briefing said Bloom units fight. Mindless swarm behavior means it should have kept committing to the breach even after taking losses. That's the whole model, overwhelmed through numbers and indifference to casualties. It didn't do that. It disengaged. It made a decision." Delgado looked at her for a long moment. "You said something about the signal back on the transport. Never finished the thought." Priya's jaw tightened. "There's a second pattern buried under the distress call. I don't think it's supposed to be there. I don't think it's an accident." Behind her, down the corridor, the station's elegant three-tone alarm was still cycling on a loop nobody had bothered to shut off, patient and calm. Completely unbothered by the fact that everything it claimed to be warning them about had already happened. If you caught what Priya's really saying before Delgado did, you already know this story's about to get a lot darker. Stick around for Chapter 3. The restricted archive wing didn't have a door so much as a suggestion that people shouldn't be there, and Priya walked through it anyway with Rays covering the corridor behind her like they were breaching a building instead of borrowing a records terminal. "You said the tissue samples from the breach were released to general research," Priya said, fingers already moving across a console that translated half its labels wrong. "They weren't. I checked twice." So somebody reclassified them after the fact. Reyes leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the corridor. That's not a filing error. That's somebody covering a trail. Priya pulled the biomatter scan up anyway. Routed through a side channel, Reyes had shown her how to open with nothing but a multi-tool and profound disrespect for Concord network security. The cellular structure bloomed across the screen in false color, and Priya went very still, the way she'd gone still on the transport 6 days and a lifetime ago. This isn't natural growth patterning. She zoomed in on a lattice structure running through the tissue like scaffolding. Natural hive organisms don't have repeating architecture this precise. This was templated. Somebody built the substrate this thing grew from. Built it when? Priya ran the decay analysis, watched the number resolve, and felt something cold settle behind her sternum. The base template's old, older than the war, older than most of the worlds it's hit. She pulled up a second file, cross-referenced against a classification code she recognized from the beacon's hidden data layer, the second pattern she'd never told anyone the full truth about, because she hadn't had proof yet, only a feeling, and feelings didn't get you access to restricted archives. Now she had proof. The program designation matched. Reyes, the signal I found buried under the distress call, it wasn't hidden by accident. It's a project code. Somebody encoded it into the beacon on purpose, like insurance, like they wanted someone to find it eventually, even if they couldn't say it out loud. She turned the screen so Reyes could see. It's the same code as this template. Reyes read it twice. Talk to me like I didn't spend the last 20 years fixing engines instead of reading alien filing systems. The bloom didn't evolve somewhere out past Concord space and wander in. It was grown, here, by them, decades ago. Priya's voice had gone very flat the way it did when she was holding something back from cracking. And the timeline lines up with the scout ship that crashed on Earth, the one that started the quarantine. Reyes stopped watching the corridor and looked at her fully for the first time. You're saying the reason Earth got locked out wasn't us? I'm saying I think whoever ran this program needed a story that explained a mess they'd already made. And a Deathworld nobody was allowed to talk to made a very convenient place to point the blame. They didn't get another 10 minutes before the corridor lights shifted to a security amber. And Thren's senior aide, a narrow, precise woman named Collett, who had been nothing but correct and pleasant to every human on the station since they'd arrived, stepped through the archive door flanked by 2 station security officers who weren't wearing the relaxed posture of people responding to a simple protocol violation. You are accessing files under seal, Collett said. Her translator lagged, but her tone didn't need translating. This is a significant breach. Funny word, breach. Reyes hadn't moved from the doorway. Same word you used 40 minutes ago for the thing that ate through your reactor housing. Step away from the terminal. Priya's hand found the drive she'd copied the files to and closed around it before her brain had finished deciding to do it. Who authorized reclassifying research data collected during an active combat operation? Because I'm looking at a chain of custody that got rewritten 3 days before we even arrived. Something shifted in Collett's face, small, controlled, the kind of crack that only showed on someone who'd spent a career learning not to show anything. You don't understand the complexity of. I understand a decades-old weapons program and a cover story that got an entire species locked behind a quarantine line for 70 years so nobody would ask questions, Priya said. That complex enough for you? Collett's hand moved toward a device on her belt, small, unhurried, the gesture of someone used to solving problems through channels rather than force. And that was exactly what made it dangerous, because nobody in the room registered it as a threat until the station's alarms cut out entirely. All of them. The elegant 3-tone evacuation warning and every status board in the corridor going dark at once. She's cutting comms, Reyes said, already moving. Priya, go now. The lights followed the alarms half a second later, and in the dark, Something down the connecting corridor that had been quiet since the reactor breach was sealed made a sound none of them had heard it make before. Not an attack sound, not the wet tearing they'd heard in the reactor housing, but something closer to a long, low exhale, patient, curious, like it had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Delgado heard the comms die from 3 decks up and didn't wait for an explanation before he was moving. Because in 30 years of deployments, he'd learned that the exact moment communications conveniently failed was never the moment things were fine. He found Alvarez already ahead of him in the dark corridor, kit slung and moving fast despite station personnel flowing the wrong direction around her, panicked without their alarms to tell them what to be panicked about. "Reactor wing," she said, not stopping. "That's where they went." They found Ray's first, blood running from a cut along her hairline where she'd taken a hit from something in the dark, dragging herself upright against a bulkhead, with the stubborn, furious focus of someone who'd rather bleed standing than sitting. "Collet cut the whole section loose," Ray said. "Locked the bulkhead's remote, trapped us in with it before I got Priya clear." "Where's Priya?" Ray's face did something Delgado had seen exactly twice before in his life, both times on men who'd had to leave someone behind and knew it before anyone told them so. "She went back for the drive. I told her to leave it, I told her." They found the breach point 100 feet further in, a service hatch torn open from the inside rather than the outside, and past it, Priya on her knees beside a support strut with the data drive still clutched in one fist and her other arm pinned beneath fallen conduit. And the creature, not attacking, not yet, coiled in the dark at the far end of the compartment in a stillness that felt worse than motion, watching, or doing whatever it did instead of watching. Alvarez didn't hesitate. She never did. She was 3 steps into the compartment, reaching for the conduit pinning Priya's arm, when the creature finally moved not toward Priya, but toward the sound and motion nearest it, toward Alvarez, fast in the particular way that had made Concord Marines freeze on sight of it 2 days ago. Delgado's shot took it in what might have been an eye cluster, and it barely slowed. Reyes threw herself into the gap between it and the 2 women with nothing but a length of scavenged station framing, and the kind of decision that doesn't leave room for a second one. It was over in 4 seconds, that felt considerably longer than 4 seconds. Delgado got Priya's arm free. Alvarez was already moving to Reyes before the creature had finished its retreat back into the dark, some part of its calculus apparently deciding the room no longer favored it, same as before, same as it always seemed to when the cost got too high. Reyes was breathing when Alvarez reached her. That was the important thing, for about 6 seconds, before it stopped being true in the specific and quiet way Alvarez recognized immediately, professionally, and hated herself for recognizing so fast. She worked anyway. She worked until there was nothing left to work with, hands steady even after her voice wasn't, and when she finally sat back on her heels in the dark, nobody said anything for a long moment, because there wasn't a version of the right thing to say that existed yet. Priya was still holding the drive. Her knuckles had gone white around it, like letting go might undo what it had cost. Delgado knelt beside Reyes and found in the pocket of her jacket a folded photograph gone soft at the creases from years of handling. A kid, maybe 8, gap-toothed, holding up a fish twice the size of his arms with the kind of pride that only exists in that particular photo, taken by that particular parent. Delgado closed his hand around it and didn't say anything either, because there wasn't anything that needed saying to a photograph. Behind them, the emergency lighting finally flickered back on, dim and red, and somewhere in that light, Collet stood frozen in the doorway she'd sealed 40 minutes earlier, looking at what her decision had cost, and finding, for the first time in her long, careful career, absolutely nothing correct or pleasant to say. If you've ever lost someone doing the right thing when the system told them not to, you already know why Chapter 4 isn't going to be about revenge. It's going to be about making it count. Stay with us." Thren didn't wait for clearance to enter the council chamber, and by the time station security caught up to stop her, she was already 3 steps past the threshold with a data drive in one hand and blood, not hers, dried along her cuff from where she'd carried Reyes' body out of the reactor wing herself, because nobody else on that ship had earned the right to. "Fleet Marshal, this session is closed." "It's about to get a great deal less closed." She slapped the drive onto the central table hard enough that 2 counselors flinched. "Play it, or I will, and I'll narrate the parts your translators get wrong." Collett was already in the room, seated near the back where aides sat, and Thren watched her go the color of old paper. The counselors didn't play it. One of them, an older man named Vess, whose family name Thren recognized from a defense subcommittee that had quietly existed for longer than she'd been alive, reached for a comm panel instead, and Delgado, who had followed Thren in with Alvarez and Priya a half step behind, put a hand flat on the panel before Vess's fingers got there. "Colonel Delgado, you have no standing in this. I've got a dead woman in a body bag 2 decks from here who died protecting evidence that you people apparently decided was worth killing for," Delgado said, not raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. "So, we're gonna play the file. Then you can debate my standing." Priya played it herself. She didn't trust anyone else's hands on it. The chamber went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone suspected, but nobody said out loud finally has a shape. Program designations, growth templates, a cross-reference, buried 3 layers deep between the bioweapons research and the flight log of a scout vessel that had gone dark over an unremarkable blue planet 70 years ago and never been spoken of honestly since. Vess didn't deny it. That told Thren more than any confession would have. He just sat very still, the way men sit when the only thing left to calculate is how much worse this is about to get. "You quarantined an entire species," Thren said into the silence, "so that nobody would ask why your own weapon got loose. And then you let 2 more worlds burn rather than admit it, because admitting it meant admitting the enemy that's been killing our people for a year is *ours. The classification decision predates most of us in this chamber," another counselor said weakly. "The reclassification of the tissue samples happened 4 days ago." Priya's voice cut clean through the room, steady despite the 22 hours she'd been awake. "That one's yours." The station's threat board lit up while the chamber was still absorbing that. 3 separate breach alerts cascading across the outer ring at once, and this time nobody moved in orderly lines waiting for departmental sign-off, because word had already spread through the crew decks the way word always does, faster than any official channel. The humans had found something. The council was covering something up, and now the thing they'd all been calling mindless was hitting the station harder than it ever had before. Like it had felt the disturbance in the air and decided to test it. "It's not coincidence," Priya said, already moving toward the tactical display. "Every major engagement pattern I've logged happened within hours of a decision point asterisk inside Concord Command. It's not psychic. It's reading our own emergency broadcast traffic and reacting to the chaos in it. It knows when we're vulnerable because we're broadcasting it." "So we go quiet," Delgado said. "We go quiet, and we go in with something better than kill counts." Priya pulled up the template data. "This thing isn't a swarm. It's what's left of an organism that was designed to grow toward a food source and never got told when to stop, because whoever built it died or covered their tracks before finishing the program. It's not malicious. It's starving, and it's been starving for decades, and every world it's hit, it's been trying to finish something nobody ever gave it an off switch for." "You're suggesting we negotiate with it," Vess said, and for the first time there was something almost like a laugh in his voice, disbelieving. "I'm suggesting your elegant, casualty-averse doctrine has been trying to kill a starving animal for a year and calling it a war, and it hasn't worked, so maybe try the thing that hasn't been tried." Priya didn't blink. "Contain it. Cut its ability to keep spreading. Then let something that isn't a weapon try to reach whatever's left in there that can still be reached. Thren looked at her for a long moment, and then at Delgado, whose face gave away nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. "Do it," Thren said. "I'll take the court-martial after, assuming there's still a council left to convene one." It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean. Alvarez spent the next 6 hours in a makeshift triage line instead of a lab, and Delgado ran containment logistics with a Concord tactical staff that had never once in their careers been asked to hold a line rather than win a battle, which took more explaining than he had patience for. Though he found the patience anyway because Reyes wouldn't have wanted the containment plan to fail on account of him losing his temper with people who were, for once, actually listening. Priya rode the forward relay drone herself, refusing to hand off the one part of the plan she understood better than anyone alive, broadcasting a signal built off the buried pattern in the original distress beacon. The same code Priya had found weeks ago and not understood yet, translated now into something closer to an apology than a command, aimed at whatever remained of intention inside the Bloom's collective mass. Nothing about the response was dramatic. There was no single moment where the swarm stood down and the room burst into applause. It was slower and stranger than that, engagement pattern shifting, the mass at the outer ring drawing inward instead of outward, clustering around the relay drone's signal instead of the nearest breach point, the way a wounded animal will sometimes go still around the one sound in a loud room that isn't a threat. It held. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that by the time Concord containment ships arrived to finish sealing the perimeter, there was something left to seal around instead of just wreckage. The council session that followed 3 days later wasn't closed to anyone. Thren made sure of that personally. Vess resigned before the formal inquiry started, which everyone in the room understood to mean something closer to a controlled fall than an admission. The quarantine records were unsealed in full. The crash, the interrogation, 70 years of a species watched and measured and never once greeted, all of it laid out for a public that had spent 4,000 years believing their own doctrine was simply better, not merely untested. They offered Earth full membership. Delgado had expected pageantry. What he got instead was a small, awkward room and a counselor who clearly wanted this over with as fast as possible, sliding a formal document across a table like a man settling a debt he resented owing. "On behalf of the Concord, we extend." "I don't need the speech." Delgado didn't touch the document yet. "I need one thing, and it's not on there, so you're gonna have to write it in by hand." "Colonel, the terms of membership are standard across all." "You knew where we were the whole time." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. 70 years you had a file on my species and you never once said hello. You just watched and took notes and hoped you'd never need us bad enough to have to explain why you never asked. He finally picked up the pen. "So here's my condition. Next time, and there's always a next time, you call sooner, not when the fourth world's already burning. Sooner." The counselor stared at him for a long moment, and then, very quietly, wrote it in. They buried the photograph with her, the one of the kid and the fish, because Alvarez said Reyes would rather have kept it than had it kept, and nobody argued with a trauma surgeon about what the dead would have wanted, not that week. Thren stood at the back of the small human ceremony they held on the station, out of uniform, for the first time anyone had seen, and said nothing the entire time, which Delgado understood better than words would have managed anyway. Afterward, walking the corridor back toward the berths, Priya finally asked the question she'd been sitting on since the council session. "You really think they'll call sooner next time?" "No," Delgado said. "I think they'll wait exactly as long as they can get away with waiting, same as every bureaucracy in the history of anything." He shrugged, and for the first time in days something that wasn't quite a smile showed up at the corner of his mouth. "But now they know somebody's gonna pick up when they finally do call. That's worth something." Somewhere behind them, a Concord engineer was very quietly asking Priya's translator device, why the humans kept calling it the Deathworld's answering service, and getting no explanation he found remotely satisfying. If a signal like that ever reaches your doorstep, you already know now who'd pick up, so tell us in the comments who you'd want on that ship with you, and stick around, because Earth just got a seat at a much bigger table.